Man. Whew. Jeez, I'm getting emotional just watching this. Hello, saints. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Jeff. I am a Christian pastor exploring everything I can about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I compare and contrast the similarities and the differences between the LDS Church and Midwestern Christianity, which is what I'm familiar with. And I want to talk about a topic today that's a bit of a tricky one, but one that I think is worth discussing, and that is the decision that a lot of people are making right now to leave the church. It's a phenomenon that we've seen especially since the pandemic. And there's one story in particular I want to look into, and it's a story of Johnny Harris, who is a fellow YouTuber. He's not only an inspiration for me for this channel, but also I co-run a video production company, and we're a really big fan of the type of content that he produces. And though I would typically find myself being critical of people who walk away from their faith, the whole point of this channel is to fight criticism with curiosity, because I think I can not only learn a lot about the LDS Church and reasons as to why someone might struggle with it, but there might even be some similarities into why people are leaving the evangelical church. So I'm gonna watch this and give you my thoughts.
I grew up Mormon. And was Mormon most of my life up until a few years ago. I then left the Mormon Church, and that is a whole story that I want to talk about today with all of you. My purpose in doing this is to share my perspective so that anyone who is in a situation like I was a couple of years ago, who is questioning and wondering, can have another perspective to lean on. I'm not looking to get into debates or to talk about the history or the theology of the church. I'll do that in future videos. Today, all I want to do is tell you the story of how and why I left the Mormon Church.
All right, let's pause right there. First of all, I think what he just said is really important, that he doesn't want to get into debates and talk about theology and history, because those are all factors naturally that are gonna play into the decision-making process of somebody who's making sense of what they believe and why they believe it. But the reason why I think it's important to pick up on what he's saying there is because he's showing that he's not looking to fight. He's actually wanting to be understood. And I think this gives insight into the fact that we're talking about people here. We're not just talking about rigid belief structures. We're talking about individuals who have stories, who deeply feel, who deeply think about existence. And he's wanting to offer a perspective that might help others. And it really does invite me into one to understanding as opposed to looking for a reason to agree or disagree with him. Let's keep going.
I grew up Mormon. Both my parents were Mormon or LDS, Latter-day Saints. I grew up going to Mormon youth camp. I then eventually served a 2-year mission in Tijuana, Mexico, where for 2 years I went around and spoke to people in Spanish about the church and learned a lot, learned to speak Spanish fluently.
Elder Harris, how you feel?
Malísimo, güey. Déjame en paz.
I then went to the Mormon University called Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, where I graduated. I went through all Mormon rituals in the church and temple. I worked in the temple as a volunteer for a time. I was very, very Mormon.
I think what he's saying here is really important. He didn't just grow up on the fringes. He grew up in Utah. He went to BYU. He was a missionary. He worked in the temple. I don't know about all the ways that someone is able to do those things, but I do know that in the LDS Church, obviously he was very tied in. His family must have been very tied in. So this really is a huge decision that he's made, which really sort of adds to the gravity of this story that he's telling us.
And I believed it. I believed deeply in the unique doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is a Christian organization unlike any other Christian organization in its doctrine.
He believed. That's huge. He wasn't just going through the motions. Belief is one of the most deeply personal aspects of who we are, because what we believe informs how we behave, how we act, the decisions that we make. So he really is taking us into a very deep place here, specifically tied to the LDS Church. He said he believed in the unique teachings or the unique perspective of the LDS Church. So it wasn't even just like religion for the sake of religion. Specifically, LDS teaching, he believed. That's pretty big.
Isabel, who also grew up Mormon, and I got married in the temple, which is a huge Mormon ritual. It's a huge part of being in the church. We got married in the temple, we went back to BYU together, and a few weeks before we graduated from BYU, we had a baby, or Izzy had a baby. I didn't have a baby. After we graduated, we moved out to Washington, D.C. And that's when my wheels really started to turn. I started to think, I have a child now. I have to decide how I raise this child and what I teach him about the world. I think having Henry really made me wonder and think about how I should teach him about the world. I had grown up with this firm conviction of the LDS doctrine and its beliefs about the world, which are very specific and very peculiar. And I really started to question, is this what I want to teach my son? And the answer initially was yes.
I find it really interesting that it was the birth of his son that started to cause his gears to turn on this issue, because I have 4 kids, and I completely relate to, and if you have kids, you probably do as well, that process of deciding these are the things that I'm going to teach my children about existence, about why they're here, about right and wrong. Those are like intrinsically tied into some of the deepest parts of who we are, and will be intrinsically tied into some of the deepest parts of who they are and who they become. So it makes sense that this is a questioning point, or a moment of really considering the range that personal belief has and the influence of those around us. And especially in the LDS Church, which is so tied into the eternal family, which that's something that's unique from evangelical Christianity. We believe that once we die and we go to heaven, that those relationships are no longer what they were on earth. It's not that we won't know the people or anything like that. There's a belief that we will. But that we were made specifically for God, for Christ, and in that relationship. And we will be eternally relationally fulfilled in that relationship. So there's a bit of a letting go. But I know in the LDS Church, the eternality that's tied to family relationships has to weigh even more heavily on the decisions that are being made about raising your children with that belief system.
So I spent an entire year reading the Book of Mormon, going to church. I had a responsibility at church that I was putting a lot of work into, and praying every morning and every night for some sort of conviction. I said, I am more earnest and sincere than I've ever been about this. I'm willing to listen to any answer. I just need an answer. I spent a year doing this. A year. It's a long time. And then I remember this day. I was biking into Washington, D.C. On a sunny, spring day, and it just hit me in some really strong way that, no, this isn't working. I've put in the years of asking and the effort towards making this work, and it wasn't working. This isn't true for me.
This is really hitting home for me because I walked through my own faith crisis whenever I was in my early 20s and I was away at school. And I remember the doubt that started to creep into my mind. It was for different reasons, but I remember praying. I remember, like you said, earnestly trying to find answers and feeling like God was far off. And it led to some pretty intense moments for me. I remember being in my car one time and I was so frustrated with God, and I actually screamed at him at the top of my lungs. Where are you? Why can't you make yourself more clear to me? Why does it seem like you're hiding? And it was a deeply personal moment, and nothing really came out of it, at least in that moment. Now, eventually, through the study of the Word and through just various things that did start happening, the Lord started to affirm His gracious presence in my life, which is why I didn't walk away from my faith. But I can relate to that desperate plea to understand, that earnest seeking to understand if this is very real. That's where faith and belief sort of hinge. They hold together in this place of being able to, like Hebrews chapter 12 says, believing in what you can't see.
So who is Izzy, Isabel, whatever you want to call her, my wife, it didn't click for her. She was not on this journey that I was on. And I came back and I told her, I said, I think I am done being Mormon. And I had always been the sort of more devout, convicted Mormon. And she was just like, what? Like, you just have decided to be out of this church? And she full on said, this is going to end our marriage. You can't just leave the church. And I just told her, I said, this is where I stand and this is what I feel. And I felt very strongly about it.
Man. Whew. Jeez, I'm getting emotional just watching this. Because, I mean, there's a sacredness in marriage, right? Where you link your life together, and faith is a huge part of that, if not it's central. And I also understand that in the LDS Church, how marriage is tied to eternality, as opposed to the rest of Christianity, where we believe that till death do we part, that once we die, we will no longer be married. Jesus teaches about this in the book of Matthew, that in heaven we will no longer marry or be married. Regardless of the theology behind it, this very deeply intimate aspect of two people who are united before God, that had to have been an incredibly difficult moment for them. And I'm really interested to hear how they walk this out, because this journey of introspection and faith is no longer just about him. Now it really is going to be impacting the people closest to him and the people he loves most.
Luckily, soon enough, Izzy was on her own path of reconciling her thoughts about the church, her qualms with the church, and soon she would join me in this path towards leaving the church. Now, I call it a path because that's exactly what it is. Leaving any Orthodox religion is not easy. There are layers and layers of psychological and cultural conditioning that you don't even realize is there until you start to peel it back. So even though we started to leave the church, we were still going to church every Sunday, which I don't really understand in retrospect. All I can say is that that's what we did every Sunday. We went to church, and there was some guilt if we didn't go to church, and so we went to church.
It makes sense that while they're wrestling with these deeply personal things regarding belief, that they're going to keep going because, like you said, that's just kind of what they do. And this speaks to sort of the layers here, where there's a letting go on a faith standpoint. The practical impact of that on a day-to-day basis is difficult. So cold turkey, stopping everything, I can imagine would be really difficult. So it makes sense why let's just kind of keep going to church until we figure out what comes next.
But we slowly started to feel an emptiness towards it. And over the course of 6 months, we finally decided to stop going to church. My behavior didn't change all of a sudden. I didn't leave the church so I could start drinking alcohol or coffee or smoking. That was not a part of the agenda for me. I kind of just carried on exactly how I had always been, except for now I looked around in the world and I didn't have a doctrinal, theological framework to understand it, which was at once exhilarating and horrifying at the same time. My existential view had been so neatly packaged by the plan of salvation, which is the key doctrinal framework within the Mormon Church, and that was now gone. I had no plan. I had no framework to make sense of the world. Exhilarating, but horrifying.
Man, that makes sense. I think we can all relate to this to a certain extent. If someone came to you right now and said, I want you to walk away from everything that you believe about your existence and about what happens beyond this life, horrifying. It makes sense why that is such a exhilarating in one sense, because it's a blank slate, but horrifying in another way, because where doubt might leave someone to leave a church, even in the decision to leave the church, there's probably doubt that moves in the opposite direction that says, but what if it actually is true? What if I am walking away from something that is going to impact me beyond this life? So I like the way he's describing this fear, because I think we can all resonate with that to a certain extent.
Most of my friends were still LDS or Mormon, and of course my family was too, so was Izzy's. And let me just try to give you a perspective on why this is such a big deal. A quick primer on Mormon theology is that our whole purpose in life is to come down here to earth, to learn and to grow and to progress and to attain knowledge, and to fulfill certain, we call them covenants or rituals. There are 4 of them that are really important to do while you're on earth. Baptism, confirmation, this hour-long ritual inside the temple, and then called the endowment, and then the sealing or marriage. If you can do those 4 things, then you're in really good shape. You have the knowledge necessary to go back and live in the top tier of heaven. And yes, in Mormon theology, there are multiple tiers of heaven.
It's interesting to hear him talk through the theology, the theological wrestling with this, because this is something that is unfamiliar to me and the rest of Christianity, that we don't necessarily believe that you have to fulfill certain rituals in order to get into a top tier of heaven. that's not even why we're here on earth. We're here on earth because God created us to live in relationship with him on this earth. But in the garden, when sin entered in, that relationship was fractured. And now existence ever since then, it's God first through the Jewish people and then through the new covenant with Jesus, has been on a rescue mission to reconcile humanity to himself. And that those who put their faith in him will live with Heavenly Father, with God for eternity. So this extra pressure to fulfill other endowments and things of that nature, covenants, is not what the rest of Christianity believes. So it's interesting to hear him sort of talk through this and why it sort of added to the intimidation factor of making this decision to walk away from the church.
If you've accepted those covenants and then you leave, you break away, you reject those covenants, you take off your garments, you say, I'm done with this, that's a pretty big deal within the LDS framework. You are no longer able to be with your family in the celestial glory of the top tier of heaven. So if you believe that, and you're a parent, and you see your child rejecting those covenants, rejecting that eternal sealing to the family, you're basically seeing your child go away, and you feel like you're losing them. So, unsurprisingly, people leaving the Mormon Church creates huge upset within families, like many other religions. It's not just an insular cultural experience. It is a deeply held doctrinal theological belief that if you leave the church, there are major consequences. Luckily, I had parents who, by the time I told them that I was leaving the church, were very open and loving and accepting of my decision. Certainly it was hurtful for them, but they did not project that onto me in any way that made me feel ostracized. Unfortunately, that is not the case for a lot of my friends, a lot of other people who have left the church.
Wow, I think that's a pretty huge blessing that he had a family that, though they didn't agree and though they were hurt, it didn't turn into sort of this bitter contention. But there was a recognition that he is where he is, and I like the word he used. They didn't project their struggle with that in the midst of what he was struggling with. I've seen a lot of other former LDS influencers, and again, even I know of a lot of people who have walked away from the evangelical church or the Protestant church, who that causes such a tension in families. It just adds to the grief and to the pain of that decision and the pressure to do things differently. And it sounds like he didn't necessarily have to face that, which I'm sure has been helpful for him as he sort of just wants to make sense of what's going on without the interference of the pressure of other people sort of being imposed on him.
But even still, with parents who were accepting and loving despite my decision, I still had years of purging and processing to do, something that continues to this day now 4 or 5 years later. What I didn't realize is that I had internalized a lot of assumptions of shame and guilt and fear and judgment that I didn't even realize I had. And for the years following leaving the church, it was a process of slowly purging and peeling back and processing those things. I went through the Mr. Nice Guy phase, which is a very common thing for people who leave the LDS church, which is like, I'm just leaving the church, nice and peaceful. I'm going to not be mean. I'm not going to be spiteful towards the church, because in the church, when you're in it, there's sort of this like archetype of the spiteful, angry anti-Mormon who goes out and spreads lies about the church, and they're just offended and angry. And I didn't want to be that person. I didn't want to be that archetype. And so I tried to maintain very cordial relationships with everybody. I tried to be super nice, like, the church was really great for me, and yet I just, disagreed with it, so I walked away. I went through that phase for a couple of years. But through therapy and through a lot of thinking about this, I came to understand that I actually had some deep problems and anger towards the church and what it instilled in me.
Man, I love his honesty here. I feel like it is so important. A lot of times we try to sanitize our feelings. We try to make them more presentable to people so that we don't feel rejected. I think it's good that he had the intention of sort of having this sort of amicable relationship as he was backing away from the church. But I also think it's super important for him to acknowledge in a really healthy way that there's some not enjoyable feelings, more difficult, uglier, harder things that I'm having to process through if I'm going to be honest. And I think that honesty is incredibly important, again, because that's the difference between going on an honest journey of discovery and trying to figure out your place in the universe and what you believe about God, as opposed to just saying, I'm angry, I want to do whatever I want to do, and throwing yourself into sort of another type of worship, if you will, and that is the worship of indulgence or the worship of bitterness. And it sounds like he's wanting to healthily walk through those things, which I can really respect.
And perhaps most frustratingly, and maybe this is going to be hard to communicate the nuance to someone who's not LDS, but I felt deep frustration at the church's claim to have a monopoly over the fullness of truth. That the few million members are the only keepers of the real truth of what God wants today for us, and that everyone else has truth too, but through prophets and apostles and modern day revelation, the Mormons are actually the ones who have the full picture. They know what's going on. I believed that they had the truth that was going to deliver me and my family to eternal bliss in celestial glory. I believed that, and I modeled my life around it deep into my adulthood. And I feel resentment that I did that. And that the stakes were so high for leaving, for expressing myself and my qualms for this doctrine. Because after all, if you question it, you're questioning prophets, people who are talking to God. You can't do that. It all left me very confused and required a lot of healing and processing that is still going on.
There is a lot of nuance in everything he's saying right here, so I want to be careful with it. But the authority structures that he felt were sort of imposing on him, things that were kind of contrary to how he was naturally wired and who he naturally was, and the pressure, the guilting, the shaming that came along with that, I think that applies to a lot of religious contexts. And to be completely honest with you, some of the deepest pain that I've experienced and that I've walked through, and even people really, really close to me have walked through, have come at the hands of people who have used authority to hurt, to violate, to control. And I can relate to that deep pain of almost betrayal of people at a higher level in an authoritative position imposing things on you that are more harmful than anything else.
The culture is not one of discourse and debate. It's one of obedience. Obedience, obedience, obedience. Obedience is a hallmark belief and tenet of the LDS experience. And as a member, you feel it.
Let's talk about this whole thing of obedience. He was just saying obedience, obedience, obedience. I can't speak into sort of the motivation or even the context of that in the LDS Church because I don't fully understand it well enough, but I know in my religious context, that is a problem. A lot of times we'll call that legalism. It's all about doing what is right, because if you don't, then you're going to lose your salvation. You have to follow these specific things in order to be saved. But I think that one thing that I want to make sure is clear in evangelical church is we don't believe that we have to obey in order to be reconciled to God. We obey because he has reconciled himself to us. You see the difference? It's the difference between sort of earning his love and his presence by obeying versus him freely giving it through Christ. And if we accept that, we obey as a result of that.
Leaving the church is painful. Socially, mentally, you experience a cost for doing so. And if you're in that situation now, which I know some of those watching are, where you know that your family and your peers will think differently of you if you decide to leave, just know that it's a lot better on the other side. If you choose yourself and you choose your personal experience and your personal expression and you honor that, as opposed to honoring the fear of obedience, there's some years of pain and adjustment, but there is a sense of freedom on the other side. This is uncomfortable for me to say. Even right now, I'm imagining whether it's family or friends who are still active believers in the church watching this, I can feel that discomfort even now, years later, of what are they thinking of me making this video and effectively talking to others who might be in the church and telling them to leave. That old archetype of the bitter ex-Mormon who's polarizing and an extremist is ringing in my ears. And yet, day by day, those voices and those old models, they dissolve more and more, and they become less loud, and they become less part of my identity. I for many years did identify as someone who used to be Mormon, and now I'm not. But yet with time, I'm slowly developing my own new identity that isn't pinned to my reactionary experience with the church, but is just pinned to who I am, what I love. I'm a father who loves my children. I love to learn about the world and explore and explain things. I love film, I love animation, I love moss, I love cooking. I love reading stories to my boys and teaching them about the world. I love traveling, I love trains, I love science. I love the beauty of our world and the mystery that it is, and the mystery of life and cultures. That appreciation is enough for me. I don't have a spiritual framework to fill the vacuum. I haven't joined some religion. Maybe someday I will, maybe I will develop that, but for now, the wonder of the world outside of the plan of salvation and God looking out over his children for this big plan of obedience, outside of that, I feel like there is plenty to stand in awe of and love without a God and a Savior to create meaning for me.
See, that's a difficult statement to hear. Was it difficult for you to hear? Because on one hand, I appreciate what he's saying, that he's trying to grapple with his identity and understand who he is outside of this pressure to obey within a church context. But for me, and again, I'm not even speaking from an LDS perspective, but that we are spiritual beings and we have to make sense of our spiritual condition. Our spiritual condition isn't determined by what we do to obey. It's determined by what Christ did on the cross. This is why grace is so important in non-LDS Christianity, because we were all made for God. So the prospect of having to obey, hoping that you've obeyed enough and done enough to get into God's presence, and if not, you'll spend eternity in heaven, yeah, but in a lesser heaven without God, we just don't teach that. We don't believe that. God's grace brings us into reconciliation with him, and as we enjoy the beauty of this life, this next life that we have to look forward to is a free gift of eternal life through his Son that we will eternally be able to enjoy in God's presence. And that there will be nobody in heaven living in a different tier of heaven who doesn't have access to that complete fulfilling presence. Nor will we have the pressure to have to progress to that. He's freely brought us to that place into his presence.
And yet there's a strange paradox within all of this that I have to talk about, which is the Mormon experience also gave me so much. My mission, while I feel conflicted about what I was doing and how I was doing it, I learned to work hard. I learned to speak Spanish. I learned to navigate in cultural experiences outside of my own. I was in Tijuana for 2 years next to a giant international border, one of the most violent and intense borders on earth. And that instilled a love for the stories of people who live near borders, which helped create my career. My parents raising me in that environment gave me beautiful experiences and community, taught me how to be industrious and hardworking and disciplined. It taught me how to care and love and serve others. Those are all good things. So how do I reconcile the pain and the psychological confusion that this organization brought to my life, packaged tightly with the reality of all of the beautiful things that it brought to my life? The good, the community, the memories, the values of honesty and service and love. That's a paradox that will probably be with me forever. It's impossible to summarize this experience as one thing, good or bad. And that's okay. That dissonance is okay.
Man, I love the way that he's describing this, because even the most devout religious person can relate to this paradox, this dissonance. He's expressed how he's experienced it in the LDS church. I'll tell you how I experience it in the non-LDS church. It's something that the Bible talks about, the battle between the flesh and the spirit. We believe the Bible teaches that we're all fallen in the flesh, but that when Christ came to bring us back to God, and he brought us into good standing with him, that doesn't mean that we're not going to grapple with the flesh and the fallen nature of who we are. So there's always a paradox. There's always this dissonance that we will experience in this life on this side of eternity because this is a fallen world. But this is why hope in Christ is so important, because we look forward to a time when the book of Revelation talks about he'll be wiping away every tear. There will be no more pain. There will be no more death. And we will live in the light of God's presence forever. Anybody who put their faith in God. And there's no more grappling with the dissonance. I think it's a great word that he's using there. But on this side of eternity, we still grapple with it. And that's all the more reason why I cling to Jesus, because he is my hope. And even when my efforts to deal with the dissonance doesn't work, and then the paradoxes don't make sense, I know I can cling to Christ's promises because of his love for me, and that I have his love to look forward to experience forever. Well, I really appreciate you letting me be honest with you about my reaction, about what I believe. And I hope some of the stuff that I was talking through might be helpful for you as you're dealing with your own doubts or if you're questioning what you believe. And most of all, I hope that you were able to fight criticism with curiosity, because really that's what this channel is all about. So until next time, I'll see you later, saints.